Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today we're doing a quick little clinic on historic review of the railroads in Yuma, Arizona, and how the railroad got to Arizona. Kind of funny story, you're all here, and I modeled the Northern Central, which ran from Baltimore up towards Sunbury, Pennsylvania, and on up to Lake Erie. I modeled the north part of it there, but I spent over 30 years in Arizona and Yuma. So once I got back into railroading, Southern Pacific ran through there. So actually quite a bit of history, enough to the point that a guy that named David Myrick, who was the historical archivist for the Southern Pacific Railroad, he wound up writing 6 books just on the railroads that were in Arizona. So you kind of wonder about that. There's quite a bit of history out there like that. So part of my adventure being in Arizona and getting back into model railroading was part of this and learning the history of it. So we'll kind of go through it. Right now, the scene I'm showing you there is Union Pacific Loco. They took over the Southern Pacific in the merger in 1996. The scene up behind it is the Yuma Territorial Prison, and we'll see a little bit more of that later. But this is an entrance into it. Just as a quick part of the history on the background of it, Southern Pacific extended from Portland all the way down to LA and over to Houston, through subsidiaries back up to Chicago, and back over through Ogden, back through Sacramento to San Francisco. So the part that we're looking at is the late 1800s, once they started kicking in from Los Angeles and heading eastward to complete the next part of the second transcontinental route. In Arizona, it was known as the Tucson Division of the Southern Pacific, which ran from the Colorado River, which was the border between California and Arizona, all the way over towards Tucson, which is down here at this junction where a line ran into Mexico down towards Nogales, and then farther over to the east, where it continued into New Mexico, through El Paso, and eventually into Houston, Texas. A little closer view of the early part of it, this is a map showing from David Myrick's book from about 1880. Southern Pacific came in from the northwest, directly southeast, kicked a little bit east, turned south to cross the Colorado River to get into Yuma. When they did the crossing, it was actually still known as Arizona City. They changed the name to Yuma shortly after that, following the name of the Indians that were in the area. The railroad followed the Gila River, kind of sort of for a ways heading eastward. Then once it got to a point farther out, made a hard right turn, headed towards Tucson and directly over that way. A little closer view, you can see where this follows into it. It drops over a big loop. I don't know how well it shows in the view there on it, but you can see off of the river where the Colorado runs north, goes up from down in Mexico, down here at the south, where it's Ogden's Landing, Mariposa Ferry, Pilot Knob, FY, that stands for a ferry boat that ran across there, Fort Yuma, which was a ferry, Potholes, Laguna, continue farther north. A lot of these towns were known by these names for the ferry boat. There was a shallow draft, very shallow bottom steamboats that were rear wheel paddled steamboats that came up from the Gulf of California. They landed there, ships would come in, transfer their load cargo over to them, and then transport farther north. The steamboats, up until shortly after the railroad came, actually went very far north. But then with the building of Hoover Dam, Parker Dam, Lake Mead was developed. There was just above Yuma there where it shows Laguna, there was a dam that was put in there for the canals that did all the irrigation. That pretty much put the end of the riverboat life. The railroad for the Southern Pacific followed down in this riverbed for the Gila. The Gila is notorious for being very finicky about its flooding. It would be not much more than a stream that you could wade across at times, and all of a sudden it would turn into this torrent of a river that would come through and change its course over a matter of a few days in a very wide valley that was down there. Once the dams were built farther up towards Phoenix, where they contained the water and saved it for the city and for the irrigation up there, it tamed most of the river. It still flows, but nowhere near as much unless it's a really big flow. But the railroad learned really quickly how fickle the Gila and even the Colorado were at times for it. This is showing Yuma shortly after the railroad came into Arizona, which is 1877. Arizona didn't become a state till 1912. So they're still known as Yuma AT, the Arizona Territory. You can see where the railroad came down, dropped through down Fort. There was one siding in town that kicked in. The depot was up here in this upper left corner, right along the river. These two buildings are up here by the river where the steamboat landings. So that was the one siding. The steamboats would still come up, transfer some of the cargo over and come out, and vice versa, where it would take it farther south. The railroad went down Compass South, Railroad East of town a ways to put in their railroad facility. You notice up here is a thing called a territorial prison. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We saw the picture at the beginning. That was a prison that was built late 1800s, was occupied and used until early 1900s for most of the prisons for the Arizona Territory. A lot of notorious felons were placed there. The worst of the worst, as what they would say. There's actually a movie, 310 to Yuma, was kind of based on it. Never showed Yuma, but it was pretty much about taking a guy from the east side of Arizona, getting him on a train and getting him transported over to the prison. It sits up on a kind of a knoll. It's a large gravel granite hill that's there. And you can see where the Gila kicks into it. And we'll look at that a little bit more later. That's becomes a prominent reason for where the railroad was at. This shows where the typical crossing, a couple of wagons, a bunch of oxen to pull it, a couple of mules up in the front, or horses in the front to get it across the river. This was on the, this is from the Arizona Archives showing the Gila where they crossed. It was a very shallow point at this time, just east of Yuma a little bit. You can see the bluffs in the back from where the river is dug through it from the floods. It just kind of washed it out. The joke with the Colorado and the Gila was that if it was much thicker, you could almost walk on top of it because there was so much silt in it. We talked about the steamboats. This is the Searchlight named steamboat. You can see that's a very shallow draft, high cabin on top of it, rear paddle boat. This is showing a flatboat that was bringing cargoes up to a levee break. They built very large levees on each side of the Colorado, trying to tame it, kind of control it to save the irrigation land, and then control for the flood and the irrigation water for the agricultural in the area on it. There was a very large flood in 1905, 1907 range, and this is where they were trying to fix one of those breaks in the levee. Up in the north part where I was talking about the steamboats, the steamboat landing, up until that point, Isaac Bahamas was the owner of that. He's this gentleman sitting in the chair on the left side. That was his crew on the left. When the Southern Pacific came in, they were on, these are these guys on the right-hand side, crew operating on it. That was their office crew, and they used part of the steamboat office until they got the station built, the early part of it. So it's kind of curious. You can see a little bit different clientele or clothing that the guys wore. You could tell them what's the different style guys that were in it. And if anybody has any questions, you're more than happy to throw a chat up for me, and then I can stop it and then answer it, or you can pause me every once in a while if you need to. This shows this is a view of the first train, one of the first trains coming into Yuma, this first locomotive coming across. It was open in 1877. On September 30th, the first train came across. The first bridges that were built were all heavy wood timbers, using some steel rods, nuts and bolts holding it all together. And notice on the back side of it, you see where there's a series of bridges go across. There's a better view coming up. But this section here, this first section is coming out of Yuma on the Arizona side, was a swing bridge, and it was a center pivot. So it would rotate, only rotate in one direction. And this part that was closest to you would turn upriver, and the other half would turn 90 degrees south. And then it was the steamboats to go past. He's part of the crew that were here. Something to note is this one guy, and I hope so you can see my cursor, the guy sitting up on the tender here. He was one of the Native Americans, one of the Indian guys that was lived around there apparently, and he must have had a fascination, must have made friends with the railroad crews, because he shows up in a lot of these pictures. And there's a couple of these that I've got. I've got the pretty big collection on that. This guy's in a lot of these pictures. Even if the railroad crew's different, he seems to have made himself at home right there with the railroad. Here's another view, and here's our buddy here. He's sitting there on top of the stack of ties. This is the first locomotive that arrived in Yuma there on September 30th. The curious thing, though, is that the whole story with the railroad is that they had built all the way down into Yuma. They had got into the river, built across the river, had built into Yuma across, had been traveling back and forth with the work train and everything like that, pushing equipment over and laid rails. But there became a dispute with one of the US government offices. I don't know if it was lands department or reclamation or who it was, but they didn't grant the railroad the permission to continue on at that point, although they had already built all the way down to it. Well, right in this picture, right above it, and on that bluff that I pointed out before, right over the top of the cab of the locomotive, you see on that bluff, that's Fort Yuma. That was an Army installation. It got started 1849 with all the miners that were going to California for the gold rush. This was pretty much the narrowest point on the Colorado, is most easily crossed. There were other spots across the river in Parker and other spots, but they were a little bit more treacherous, not as easily crossed as this location. So a lot of the gold miners, when they came across, this is where they were at, and the Army had an installation there. Well, at this point in 1877, it amounted to 5 people. One was Major Thomas Dunn. He had 2 enlisted personnel with him, 1 doctor and 1 prisoner that they had, and that was it. Well, on September 29th, they caught wind that the railroad was looking at probably going ahead and pressing through and going into the town anyway, because they were tired of waiting. It had been going on for a couple of days and hadn't got permission to go, and whatever bureaucracy was going on. Well, they were directed to post a sentry on the bridge. So back on the bridge, at this point, they had a sentry there that was guarding it. Well, the guard went off duty at 11 o'clock that night. And as things would happen, the railroad crew went to work. They finished their line across that night and almost made it until just before dawn when they dropped the rail. Well, that rail made such a clatter, such a big noise, that it alerted the Army guys. They took off down the hill to stop the train. Well, then the actual first train kind of rolled on. As the train came up, it wasn't stopping, and they stepped aside. And that was pretty much the unceremoniously way that they gave into it, and the train arrived into Yuma. This gives you a better view of that bridge, series of small wooden trusses going on, very light locos, very light cars. A little bit of view of the river, you get that flow where it's going across into it. This is pretty much an average flow. Better view of Fort Yuma up there on the top on the back side of it. This is a looking view of north by northeast into California, across the North Colorado. Well, that bridge lasted about 7 years before, between the Colorado and the Gila, they decided to flood and washed out the bridge. So they rebuilt the bridge, built it a little bit bigger, pretty much the same style and everything like that. Came back at it, got it built, took them a couple of months. Well, a couple months later in April, they had a transient that was a hobo that was riding the train that got kicked off. And there's a documented story where he got upset that he got kicked off the train and he set the bridge on fire. Well, it burned up a good part of the bridge. They wound up catching the guy later and throwing him in the jail. He found himself there in the Yuma prison. So they reconstructed the bridge this time only to use a little bit bigger timbers, better sized bridge, a lot more durable for it because of the flooding that washed out the other ones. You can still see on the right side the swing bridge portion of it, just at the very edge of it there. 1891, they overhauled it. You can see a bigger bridge in the back. If you notice, it's about the only good view of that style bridge. Fewer piers, a little bit heavier duty, still has the swing bridge there. You can see it there in the back center of it. But the spans were a lot longer and a lot stronger for what they was going into. This is actually a really good view. Shows you the steamboat landing and then the sheds where they would offload the cargo and they would transport it up to. This view was taken up on the hill where the territorial prison was at. So it kind of gives you a view of how close it is and the difference in the height out of them. Well, at this point, the railroad pretty much knew that we've got to do something on it. Trains are getting bigger, they're getting heavier. Wooden bridges aren't holding it. We've got to do something that's going to stand up to the flooding. So 4 years later, in 1895, they built a heavier bridge with steel trusses. And this is a view of that one where it got into a larger trusses, bigger spans, made it a lot more durable, a lot more stable for it with the concrete abutments for it. At this point, pretty much the river cargo had stopped. They didn't put the swing span back into it. You can see the searchlight was still there. It still came up and down from the Gulf of California. They had one on the north side of the bridge, but the passages of traffic back and forth had pretty much stopped at this point. Up on the hill in the back is a curious thing. There was a small pump house down along the river, pumped it up to this building and into these tanks. On top of the hill here, in this flat hill space area, were settling tanks. The railroad for water for the tenders would pump up in that tank. It was sitting there, and once it got to a point, it would drop into a next tank over it, which is next size, and then drop into the next tank. And there was a series of 3 or 4 of those tanks. They were probably 20 or 30 feet square, hold quite a bit of water in it. And that was their initial water treatment to get all the sediment out of as much as they could out of the water. Here's another view of it, just showing you looking down the river. And this was such a prominent issue that it became an actual postcard. That's what the view is down at the bottom here, a postcard of the bridges there. And as we talk about the flooding, here we show that the river and steel bridges, the river's doing its thing. It's just flooding pretty heavy. You can notice Fort Yuma up there on the back right side, and on the far side of the river, there was these levees. On the California side, there was a handful of tracks, a couple sidings and past sidings because it was a single track bridge across. So they had to set up to have meets, and they had a couple sidings for delivering cargo on that side. But in 1905, just from the amount of heavy snowfall in Colorado and northern Arizona, eastern Arizona, New Mexico, wherever the Gila River and the Colorado River watershed dropped in from, flooded it for pretty much the whole year. Added to it, I believe there was a hurricane or something that came through and just really pounded the area. Well, one of these levees on this side, the California side, down about 4 or 5 miles from this point, gave way. And when it let loose, all the flow from the Colorado and the Gila diverted and went the easiest path of least resistance. So it actually cut across Mexico, went west, got farther almost to by Mexicali, which is about 40 miles. Then it turned north into what became the New River, it called it, because it didn't exist. It was a new river at that point, and went north into the Imperial Valley of California, into an area called the Salton Sink. The Salton Sink was an area that's about 40 to 60 feet below sea level. Well, over the next year, this filled with water. Almost every bit of the Colorado River flow went through that route and became the the Salton Sink became the Salton Sea, and it refilled it. Before that, it had been a prehistoric part of the ocean. When the water levels dropped, they left back large deposits of salt. There was actually a station there, and one of the things they did was they actually cultivated the salt from there, bagged it up, and shipped it out. So here's a view looking eastward. You look at the 2 points, one on the left, that's where Fort Yuma was. On the right is where the prison is. And this rocky outcropping in between was the narrowest point. So the Colorado River would go straight up here to the side. The Gila would come in off the right, and they both joined. The confluence between the two of them was right in this area. And at this point, you can still see one of those ferry boats is still in operation that would run back and forth across the river on it. Now, you might ask, why did the railroad not build up there on that higher point? Well, that's a good question. Back when the Southern Pacific was going eastward, coming out of California, heading towards their point, they were supposed to meet up with the Texas and Pacific Railroad. The Texas Pacific started in Houston, and it was supposed to make it all the way across. And their meeting point was supposed to be in this area in Yuma. The TMP had surveyed and had gotten easements all the way up to this point and across at this high point between these two river peaks here, or the rock outcroppings. And they wouldn't share their easement. So that's why the railroad, when they cut down to the south here, the Southern Pacific, they cut in and went to Yuma on their own, because the Texas Pacific never really made it out of Texas, never made up to their legend of their name of the Pacific. In fact, they barely made it to El Paso, to a place called Sierra Blancas, where they finally actually did wind up meeting. So we were talking about that. This is the point up here in the top, this rocky outcropping. You've got the territorial prison was started, built in for Yuma on the other side. This is where the TMP was supposed to go through. They had an easement that was up here right along this edge of this mesa. Off on the right, you can see where it says Gila River floodplain. At one point, the river would come up. If it flooded enough, it would actually come up the spot where it says Dolan Street, come down Gila Street, and would flood right back into it and go back into the river down there. A lot of the houses at this point in Yuma were built of adobe, which is clay and baked, and they just painted the bricks. So it really wasn't even a hard brick, it was a soft brick. So it got wet, it would sit and dissolve. So it pretty much turned itself back into the ground where it came from. So it was a vicious little circle when they got flooded out. Well, SP was already down on its spot. It was pretty all happy with where they were at. They knew that they were going to have to move at some point. They were looked at trying to rebuild where they're at, trying to raise the bridge. They had issues because on the backside of where they got into Yuma, it was actually running down the middle of the street there for several blocks, about half a mile. That was pretty restricted. They couldn't get around it. A lot of the town was down farther east. So they were trying to figure out what they were doing. Well, come along this thing called the automobile, and up until this point, they had been transporting across on ferries to get across the river still. Well, in 1915, they built this ocean-to-ocean highway bridge between Prison Hill and Fort Yuma Hill. The bridge is about 336 feet long, and they renovated it, opened it back up. It was closed for quite a bit because they needed to do some renovation on it. But this is a view of it. So the highway beat the railroad to it, that spot. Well, by the early 1900s or 1920s, Southern Pacific finally got the easement to get across the river at the TMP easement bridge on it, so they can get up on that high point. So in 1923, they built a new truss bridge in the back. You can see it back there. This is, you can see the steam shovel. It's working on digging the hill out where the prison was at, and they got this rolled on through there. It was quite an undertaking. The railroad, Southern Pacific, actually made this a very huge project. They realigned all the way up to close by the prison, up by Fort Yuma, built a whole new depot, and this was a good junction with actually extending the railroad line up into Phoenix, because at this point, Phoenix had been on a branch line. The Santa Fe ran from Flagstaff and Williams Junction area, ran down through the mountains, got into Phoenix from the north. So then the Southern Pacific was like, well, we got to get our main line up into Phoenix instead of doing a branch line being access into it. The prison, though, at this point hadn't been used. They had moved out of it. They were there for years, and then they moved out of it, went to Florence, which is where the state prison became at. So it sat vacant for a while, and curiously enough, was actually used by the high school for a few years as their classrooms while they were getting a new high school built, because the fire destroyed the other one. And curious enough, this is a view of that prison. This is a territorial prison. You can see that it was built, they actually was built by the prisoners themselves. They put them to work as part of the chain gangs on it, and constructed most of the prison on itself, and it's built out of the granite, local granite, and the walls are 2 feet or better thick in spots. The high school, in fact, my wife graduated from here, is known as the Yuma High School Criminals, is their mascot. And when they graduate from high school, they're known as being parolees because they've been released from the high school. So it's a trademark logo, and they have a lot of paraphernalia that they sell you, everything from T-shirts to clothes to hats, everything else. It's a pretty big deal with them. It's one of the more notorious high school mascots, if you will. And the prison itself is a pretty neat tour. If you're ever out that way, it's well worth a stop. It's probably about, you can go through it all. You spend probably hour, 2 hours there or better. You're looking at everything. Quite a neat place. There's a more recent view. You can see off to the left how they've, so it looks a little bit nicer than it did as a prison. You've got the main entrance there. There's a guard tower off to the left, which had a water tank underneath it. But they've got a lot of artifacts, a lot of paraphernalia, and a lot of history and stories of the prisoners that they had there, and it gives them the backstory behind it. So this is a good view showing you between the two locations, the two bridges crossing the Colorado at this point. The Southern Pacific's bridge that was built, and then the Ocean Highway Bridge. That's US Highway 80. And as we talked about, railroad came across, dropped up around a little bit east of Yuma. It got through the mountains. It split in a town called Weldon. One line went to the north. Here's Yuma shown in the red. This is the original main line. Shot straight across Arizona, got up here around the mountains, turned to the right, came back down. This area down farther south is very desolate, no water to be found at all. So the railroad held pretty tight to being able spots that they could access water to keep for the locomotives. This line here to the north, it shows in orange, was the 1926 routing. Went up across, got to Phoenix, which by then was the state capital, and then dropped back down to it. The original capital for Arizona was Prescott, and then they moved it to Phoenix. A couple other lines, there's lots of other lines that branched out from it different directions on. One of the bridges of interest out there on the Gila Ridge or the Gila River line was these truss bridges out in Antelope Hill area. 12 of them, all identical, going across the Gila River. Kind of a current view, you can see how wide a span it is. At this point, probably 3/4 of the way, there's a little bit of a stream where it runs across, might be a couple feet deep and 8 or 10 feet wide, and that was about the extent. 1995, I was out there and had a really big flood where they had a lot of rain and snowfall out to the farther side. And this was full from bank to bank, and then 3/4 of the way up, there was a bridge abutments underneath it. There were spots out there where levees had washed out, and they were kind of concerned about this bridge getting washed out too, but it survived and it's still operational today. There's some backyard views of it. This is the original line, postcard view showing the Southern Pacific Hotel and the depot. The depot was the first part. This part that paralleled the tracks was the original part. Traffic got so good within the next couple of years that they added on this L section to this coming off the backside. First story was all dining rooms. The second floor was all hotel rooms. There's railroad offices where this side showing the tracks. You can see it's a steel bridge, Fort Yuma in the back, the highway bridges in the back here on the right, the Ocean Bridge. So this dates it somewhere around 1917, 1920, somewhere in there. Here's another view, a little bit clearer picture. Shows you a train pulling out of it. Let's talk about those water towers, the water settling tanks. You can see the steps that led up to it, got you up there, and that's about where this view was for it. If you look off in the far right corner, right over top these baggage wagons, you can see where it says Southern Pacific. It reads Southern Pacific, and then you see where it says free. We'll show you a better picture of that because that's kind of an interesting story for that. Another view of the depot, the hotel. This is off to the right side of it. The building was pretty much built out of redwood. It survived very well. Even after the relocation of the rail line, they took out the bridges that were there, took out the line, lost its connection there at this point. The railroad served as a hotel hospital into the 1930s for tuberculosis patients. At that point, then it was closed down and it was dismantled, and all the lumber was reused. One of the hotels in town, the Peach's Best Western Motel, which still exists now and still used. I got to meet the people and they took me through, and they've got a lot of memorabilia. They got a little museum there, and they showed me one part of the hotel that was built out of a significant portion of this hotel where they went down, and we were able to salvage a lot of it for all the bigger beams and everything. So it was pretty interesting on that part. This is what it's remains of the hotel. They did a big renovation project down in that area on the Pivot Point Park, they call it. Survey markers, they marked out the whole corner of it, the building, and this is some of the foundations on it. They did a pretty intensive archaeological dig on it. I was surprised on how much effort they went into it. They were pretty impressive on it. In the museum, they've got a lot of things that they found on it and pulled all this up and saved it. So it was a nice job for them. We were actually able to build a scale model of it that we put in the museum and donated to them, showing what the actual building looked like. And we used these survey markers with some plans to correlate between the two of them to verify the sizes of it. That one picture before where it showed I was standing up on the hill, I was staying by the water tanks where the picture was taken. If you would turn to your right, you would look into Yuma, and this is where you would see in the 1880s, right around that time period. The railroad cut through these really soft hills. There's a little bit of soft clay, mostly sand, a little bit of gravel into it, not a whole lot to it. The one siding that went down to the steamboat landing is this one here. You can see where it cuts off to the side. You can see the steam locomotive down there farther to the right, and then off even farther, it bends off to the left and down by that hill. That's where the roundhouse was. They had it was a 4 or 5 stall roundhouse that was down there. Turntable and some basic engine facilities and more sidings and all. Curious thing is, I've got to find that picture. I couldn't find it. I've got a picture showing the roundhouse, and one of the locomotives in there is the Central Pacific locomotive, the Jupiter, that was at the Golden Spike ceremony. So it was assigned and operating down here for a while. Let me bump back here a sec. If you notice this building here, that's this on outcropping, it's sitting up on a little bit of a hill here. That's this one here. It's called the Pilot Knob Hotel. Sat up on top of this hill, and it says free board every day the sun doesn't shine. Well, that amounted to maybe 10 days a year that somebody got a free meal at the place. The Southern Pacific Depot Hotel had the same thing out there. It was a free board for any day the sun doesn't shine. That's big thing out there is you've got about 355 days a year, 355 days a year that the sun's shining. That's why it's so dry and hot. This is Pivot Point. This is the original where the railroad main line came through. On the left, that view's from about 1980s, 1990s, or somewhere around that point. The water settling tanks are up here on the left, up on that hill, what's left of them. They wound up demolishing those as part of a renovation project. There's a Best Western Hotel that's up there now. They saved a little bit of the remnants for it, but they didn't need them historically significant for it. But this would be the view looking across. What they did though is the whole thing in that, the whole theme in there is Pivot Point. It's all for the railroad still. So there's some interpretive signs. You can see in the sidewalk where there's the 2 sets of rails that go across and aim across the river. So it gives you that view as if you were standing there on it. And this is the pivot for the swing bridge. It's still there, got it protected for it around some fencing and all. And they actually have where these pipes are coming out, it's a laser light show that shoots across there at nighttime. So you can see where the lights are, and that gives you the symbol for where the tracks ran across. And still right now in the little plaza that's all around there, they have speakers set up, and every hour and half hour, it sounds like a train. They play the speakers coming over the sound system there, and it sounds like a steam locomotive and train rolling into town. Southern Pacific's 2521 steam loco, 280, is on display there. This is an early picture after it was placed in it. It had been in Yuma for many years. At one point, it was actually in that previous picture where I showed you a view. It was actually sitting there and it just had a chain link fence around it. And it had a small metal fence or metal staircase that went up to it. And some people had taken a little bit of care to it, but it was pretty much overgrown and neglected and hadn't been really used. So they actually moved this whole thing over to what's called the Quartermaster Depot, which is about a mile away. Had it in that state park there for a while. It was protected and got some good care there where it was not damaged. But as part of the renovation, they moved it back up here, freshly painted, and then the Model Railroad Club and the historical group there keep pretty good eyes on it now and make sure it's maintained. And When I talked about the realignment for the new bridge and everything, this was the depot that was built. It opened up in 1926. That's the new view of it. Art Deco style, very large, very ornate building. Very busy at the time on it. The view on the right is 1983, was one of the later views of it. Amtrak still runs through here, but the depot's not there anymore. 1995, there was a fire during a very big windstorm that was going on. It was terribly windy. It was 50, 60-mile-an-hour winds. Fire kicked up on the north end of the building, got up into the roof, and it was already burning through the whole main section of it before most of the fire apparatus got there, and they couldn't contain it and wound up collapsing on it. They couldn't save it. This is a view of that area. The station would have been off to the right. Right in the center, you can see there's the remnants of a 100,000-gallon steel water tank that was up there. Now it's pretty much there. Amtrak, like I said, still comes through there, makes a stop with the Sunset Limited. Unceremoniously, it stops up. There's an underground tunnel still from the old depot that came up, and right here with these little guard fences around it, that's where the ramps come up out from the under tunnel to it. A couple of views to show here. This is the new alignment after the 1926. They came across here on the right side. Before that, though, on the original alignment, it came up this hill and crossed over it. The railroad did a little bit digging into the embankment, but it really didn't do a whole lot. They let the train do its work and get up over the hill, but they closed off the old alignment here when they redug this. And if you notice this, I wanted to add this picture into it. You can see what they used for the barricades, some old rail, and just welded it in place as barricades. So good modeling detail if you need something like that. Back when I was talking about the railroads and the levees, they used the railroad to build it. They would either use dump trails and load them off in the front and just dump it on the ground, or they would drive wooden trestle piles into it, roll the dump cars over it, and then drop the dirt into it and then compact it. Going south from Yuma on the Arizona side was known as the Yuma Valley branch. This was operated by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. They still actually own it because there's what's called a desalting plant. And it's pretty much an experimental plant of taking canal water that comes out of the different parts of the agriculture area and desalting it, if you will, desalination, and then they put it back into the river. And it's one of the largest facilities like that, and they've shown that they can do it. So they've actually put it in operation a couple times where they were running at full capacity. It's a pretty impressive plant. And the railroad tracks still run down there in case they ever need to move machinery in and out, but there's no regular rail operations on it. This is the only known photograph that I've ever been able to find of that line with a train on it. On the California side, where it went up to what on the original map that I showed you, where it said potholes, they built what's called the Laguna Dam. And the Laguna Dam was one of the early dams on it that it was called a weir, W-E-I-R, where it would seine off part of the water, and it wouldn't stop all the water, but it would slide it across, pull it into the dams, get it into the canals, and then it would go off for the irrigation for all the agricultural fields. This is the view of that area by Laguna. You can see up here the gates that come across, they would drop down to regulate the flow. A little bit of work area space, and then the actual dam itself ran all the way across the river. It was very broad, wide spans here. A lot of railroad tracks in this area, a lot of machinery, a lot of equipment going on for all this. This branch ran up to here. The mountains in the backside, they used them as quarry to pull in a lot of the gravel they used for it. The only thing that exists now is part on this road. This roadbed here is the road still that exists now that runs up there, and then part of the irrigation, the canals in there. All that's still in operation, but the rest of all the railroad, there's no signs of it at all except for some of the roadbed. I mentioned about the Salton Sea. This was the depot that was out there. This is up on the north end of what's now the Salton Sea, closer towards Indio. The railroad had to move multiple times. There's pictures of where they had the railroad built up on trestles for sections of it because it flooded, and they would keep moving it up another 10 feet higher in elevation because they never thought it would get that high, and then sure enough it did, and so they had to keep moving it and rolling it. And eventually they got the water control, but the Salton Sea is still there now. This curious little bridge building here on this side, a lot of people think it's a railroad station, but it's actually an agricultural inspection station. When they built the Ocean Highway Bridge, the US 80 bridge, you would come up, you would stop here, and it shows you on the right side. They would check to make sure that you're not bringing any fruits or any pests that would be getting into California, and could be quite a hazard into all the agriculture there. Around Yuma, you'll find there was all kinds of these old wooden reefer cars. They must have brought them in by the trainload when they got done with them, because you can find these everywhere. They're in people's backyards for sheds. This one was a business, it was a welding place. They had it full of just sheet metal and settling tanks and extra storage of stuff. We found them on farms. We were going out, we would just happen to look around, and a lot of people didn't even realize what they were until they started looking at it, and it's kind of interesting. This one they painted white. A couple of them still had the orange paint on it, still showing PFE on it. Little speeder car that was used to get around for work trains. They would run between the quartermaster depot and the steamboat landing with a couple carts behind it, run their cargo back and forth. This wooden coach car here was built, actually wound up in Yuma. It ran up in Northern California as a commuter coach car, got transferred in the maintenance away service, wound up in Yuma, and then down on that Bureau Reclamation branch in the Yuma Valley, it wound up down there with two others. The other two got burnt back in the 1930s when they got abandoned down there, just left down there for a while. The American Legion Post was able to get this one, and they were using it for something for a while, and then a local collector guy, this guy had a little bit of everything. He wound up getting this, and then he put it away and stored it inside a building for many, many years, which is probably the reason it survived. This picture doesn't show it, but it actually got moved up to the quartermaster depot and got some renovation and preservation work done to it. Doesn't have any trucks with it, but the trucks that they put on it were caboose trucks now, so which nowhere near accurate, but at least it's on wheels there. This is the Yuma Valley Railroad. This was a tourist line that ran for quite a while on that Yuma branch line. They ran pretty far down, almost down to Somerton, and came back, went to some picnic grounds down there. Unfortunately, some internal problems they had in operations with the Bureau of Reclamation on the line. All that equipment got sold off or scrapped. This is a early vintage work train view. We don't have a specific location. All it said near Yuma, Arizona. That's all we know. So we don't know if this was up by the Salton Sea while they were trying to build some of the bridging, or if they were just using it, putting the piling into it and putting the fill onto it. But this is pretty much what they did, is they would put these pilings in, build the track across it, and then come back and put all this fill on top of it, and then pack it in to give you that upper level on it. And that's pretty much my presentation. This is a view just looking back in Yuma at the sunset. So hope you enjoyed it. And if you got any questions, I'm happy to take them.